Thank you, NIICE. Namaste, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are. Sincere thank you to Pramodji and NIICE team for pulling on such an intellectually rich convention and trusting me to build this panel. I'm also grateful to amazing panelists who accepted my invitation at a very short notice to grace this session. I'm thankful to Dr. Farah, Apekshya, Prasai, Dr. Dipti, Tamang, and Khushi Singh Rathore for trusting me. And also I'm grateful that Natasha Singh Raghubangshi, Dr. Priti Sharma for joining us to make this panel bigger and stronger. Before we start just housekeeping issues, I want to address a few things. Each presenter will have a strict 7 to 10 minutes to present. We have divided the session into 2 sub-sessions so that audience can have a breather and ask questions after 45 minutes. On the order of panel on the convention program, the first sub-session constitutes Dr. Farah, Apekshya Prasai, and Dr. Dipti Tamang. We will have 15 minutes of Q&A after the first sub-session. Our second sub-session will start approximately around 7 p.m. In the second session, Khushi Singh Rathore, Natasha Singh Raghubangshi, and Dr. Priti Sharma will be presenting their research, followed by, again, 15 minutes of Q&A. You can send me questions through chat function. I will collect them and present it to speakers. You don't have to wait until the end of sub-session to send questions. Please indicate whether your question is to the specific speaker or to anybody on the panel. If you want to ask a question by yourself, then use raise your hand function on Zoom. I will slightly abuse my privilege as the chair to lay out overarching themes and scope that form the core parts of security from gender perspective. Initially, my plan was to present my own comparative study on the female combatants in South Asia, but thank you so much, Apekshya, for bailing me out so that I can enjoy this rare intellectual feast without having to worry about my presentation. Apekshya is presenting on women's participation in South Asia and Southeast Asian rebel organization. Today I had my second COVID jab, so feeling moderate temperature and discomfort on my left arm. This would have affected my preparation for the presentation, and apologies if I become a little patchy, slow, or incoherent with my role. In the next 7 minutes or so, I will rather try to highlight major themes of gender and security by answering the question, what is security from gender perspective? And I hope our stellar lineup of panelists will pick up on some of them variously through their incredible research and scholarship on gender and security. Gender is important, essential for us critical questions and finding answers to security problems in the world. Feminist research on security, irrespective of any strand of feminism, would suggest that gender hierarchy, which is the defining feature of the world we live in, plays a significant role in determining what is security, what is the dividing line between security and insecurity, and how, where, and to whom to dispense security. In traditional understanding of security, war is the single most important source of insecurity in the world, requiring most attention and resources. But this narrow concept of security is problematized by feminist security scholars. Now, I want to draw from existing feminist works and also from my research findings on gender and war to problematize the traditional conception of war, that is its exceptionality, myth, the boundedness, and the unidimensional view of the war. First, the exceptionality of war. Feminist security scholars question the epistemic prioritization of violence in war. Yes, there is a lot of deaths, destruction, suffering in war. Therefore, it should be studied and talked about. However, intellectual prioritization of war also deflects attention from and legitimizes everyday experiences of violence occurring before and after the war. Second, myth of war. Feminist scholarship has debunked various gender myths that make war a legitimate and rational conduct. There are many such myths. Some of these include what Marian Iris Young calls the logic of masculinist protection. The idea that men fight war, put themselves in harm's way and sacrifice to protect women, children, and vulnerable population. My own research also highlights some of the gender myths of war. First, many women fight as combatants. Second, these wars victimize those on behalf of whom they are waged. Finally, wars are intrinsic to patriarchy and masculinity. Third, the boundedness of violence. Feminist works so that the violence works in continuum rather than temporally bounded between fixed start and end date, bounded in a specific locality or bounded in particular level. This is not to say that the violence within war and outside war are same, to conflate conceptually distinct methods, norms, and means of violence employed, but this is to say that the violence in war cannot be understood separately and differently from everyday forms of violence. Cynthia Cockburn is very insightful on this point. To understand violence holistically, we need to understand and analyze temporal connection between violence before, during, and after the war. We also need to see connection between violence in different spheres: political, economic, legal, sociocultural, and epistemic spheres. And finally, violence is multi-scalar. The intimate, interpersonal, local, global violence are entangled and interconnected. In my research, I look at different everyday violence faced by women ex-combatants even after the war. Finally, the matrices of domination. The way one experiences violence or security is gendered. Gender is the first thing to look at, but we should not stop there because it is also equally classed, raced, and in so many other ways. Otherwise, this gives us an unidimensional view of violence and security. In my own work, while looking at everyday violence that women ex-combatants experience, I find their class, caste, ethnicity, educational status, their geographical location very useful to understand and analyze the types of insecurity and vulnerabilities they face. So just to recap, 4 concepts that I discussed: exceptionality of war, myths of war, continua of violence, and matrices of domination, which are some of the core concepts in feminist understanding of security and insecurity. So that's all from me. I'm sure the panelists will offer more nuanced and textured understanding of gender and security through their research projects. I can't wait to hear from my fellow panelists. Our first presenter is Dr. Farah Naz. Her title of presentation is Women Peacebuilder, a case study of Pakistan. Dr. Farah Naz is serving as assistant professor at the Department of Government and Public Policy, National University of Sciences and Technology, Pakistan. She is a member of Expert Advisory Group, National Security Division, Pakistan. Review research articles and grants for the International Peace Research Association Foundation. Before joining NIICE in November 2019, she served as academic staff and sessional lecturer at the University of Sydney, Macquarie University, and Australian Catholic University, Australia. She has over 10 years of experience working with government and academic organization in Australia and Pakistan. She holds an excellent record of publication. Her research focuses her research focus has consistently been on identifying the role of religion in peace, gender, and politics at domestic and international levels. And she has published in some leading journals of political sciences. Dr. Nas has recently published an edited book called COVID-19 Challenges for Pakistan. Her second book, Living Under Hybrid War, is in the press. Dr. Nas received her PhD in Government and International Relations from the University of Sydney in Australia. Dr. Farah, the screen is yours. Is Farah not here? Oh. I thought I saw her. Okay, in that case, I will then invite next speaker. So, Apekshya, are you ready to present yours?
Yes.
Wait. Okay. So, Apekshya Prasai is presenting on understanding women's participation in South and Southeast Asia rebel organization. Apekshya Prasai is a PhD candidate in the Department of Political Science at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she studies gender process of civil war. Her research examines gender practices, women's activism, and women's inclusion within rebel organization, and interrogates how women's agitation influences gender dynamics within rebel groups. Her scholarship focuses on South Asia, particularly Nepal, where she has conducted fieldwork among former Maoist rebels. Previously, she has conducted field-based research on impact of disaster aid on women's economic empowerment post-2015 earthquake in Nepal, and has also designed and implemented programs to support violence-affected women and children in the country. Apekshya is non-resident fellow at Nepal Peacebuilding Initiative and junior scholar with the International Policy Scholars Consortium and Network. Apekshya, floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me set up my slides. Can you see the slides?
Yeah, we can see that.
Wait, hold on, sorry. Okay, can you still see the slides?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to everyone else who has joined us in this panel. My name is Apekshya Prasai, and I'm a PhD candidate in political science at MIT. And today in this presentation, I'll be providing a brief historical overview of women's participation in rebellion with a focus on South and Southeast Asian conflicts. I will then discuss the limitations of existing political science paradigms used to analyze rebellion and highlight how these limitations affect the theories we come up with about conflict and the policies we make to prevent and terminate conflict. Then I will conclude with some thoughts on how we can move forward and revise the research agenda on women in conflict to be more sensitive to the participation of women in rebel groups as fighters. So even though scholars have only recently begun to engage with questions of women's participation in rebellion, women all over the world, including women in Asia, have actively participated in conflicts for centuries. For instance, in 1904, the imperial powers of Japan and Russia began fighting a war over competing interests in Manchuria and Korea. And while the war was primarily fought between the imperial armies of Japan and Russia, there's evidence that several Japanese women took up arms and fought during this war. During World War I, broadening the horizon to Eurasia, we find that significant numbers of women fought on opposing sides of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. And in fact, during the revolution, women were organized into many women's battalions and were most famous for serving in all women's battalions known as Women's Battalion of Death. And similarly, during World War II, although women's mobilization into the labor force to sustain the war economies of Western powers has received considerable scholarly attention, beyond participating in the state-based labor force, women also played a critical role in sustaining the military force of non-state actors. For instance, the Indian National Army, which was formed in 1942 in Southeast Asia with the aim of overthrowing British rule in India, included several female members. In fact, when it was formed, several expatriate Indian women in Southeast Asia joined the INA, and the INA even formed a dedicated women's regiment in 1943 named the Rani of Jhansi Regiment. In the aftermath of the Second World War, during the era of decolonization and wars of national liberation, women fought on behalf of groups across the ideological spectrum, whether as communist revolutionaries for groups like the Malaysian Communist Party or as nationalists during the Bangladesh's War of Independence. Women played a crucial role in shaping the post-colonial trajectories of many, if not all, South and Southeast Asian nations. Nevertheless, their contributions to these nation-building projects has remained largely sidelined in the decades after. A similar trend can be found in the conflicts during the Cold War. The Cold War era was characterized by several proxy wars between the US and the Soviet Union around the world. And in many of such wars, the Vietnam War being one of the most notorious one, women played a central role in sustaining insurgent violence against significantly more powerful enemies. From shooting American planes while hiding in the fields to running hospitals in the rear and transporting materials through the underground Ho Chi Minh Trail, the multi-year Vietnamese resistance against a much more powerful American force was sustained on the backs of women's labor. In the post-Cold War era, as civil wars came to replace interstate wars as the main form of conflict in the world, violence against women, especially sexual violence against women, captured the world's attention. However, while it is true that during this era, many women from Bosnia to Rwanda were subjected to heinous sexual violence, many women also participated in armed movements as perpetrators of violence. For instance, right here in Nepal, hundreds of women joined the ranks of People's Liberation Army and served in many roles such as fighters, commanders, porters, spies, messengers, radio operators, nurses, and everything, all the roles available in the conflict. In the last 2 decades, women have continued to play a pivotal role in conflicts across Asia and the world. So from Sri Lanka to Kashmir to Syria to Iraq, like thousands of women have mobilized into ethno-secessionists, jihadists, and nationalist groups in Asia and beyond, and women have fought on both sides of the global war on terror. Yet, gendered assumptions about women's universal victimization and lack of agency during war pervades the academy as well as policymaking. Despite the wealth of empirical evidence establishing women's widespread participation in a variety of armed movements across the world, the men as perpetrators and women as victims dichotomy continues to perpetuate itself and characterize women as objects to be fought over and saved. As a result, women's wartime experiences beyond victimhood and the central role they play within rebel groups across the world is often neglected. This oversight has meant that many key theories of conflict rest upon inaccurate and implicit assumptions about who fights in conflicts and are substantiated using biased data. For example, Tedgar's foundational text frames rebellion as an exclusively male enterprise and asks, why do men rebel? Similarly, Collier-Heffler's influential paper assessing the drivers of civil war participation relies on male-specific variables like male school enrollment, and thereby excludes from their analysis a whole host of factors that may be triggering women's participation in civil wars. Additionally, analyzing women's participation in rebel groups is also critical for understanding a variety of key outcomes. For instance, scholars have found that groups that recruit female combatants are more likely to achieve victory than those that do not. They also find that where rebel groups have female fighters, the peace agreements they negotiate tend to include gendered provisions to safeguard women's rights in the post-conflict world. Research has also found that groups with female fighters tend to field larger armies and receive more financing from transnational actors. We also know that conflicts where women are mobilized as fighters tend to last longer. And some scholars have argued that the presence of female fighters may decrease a rebel group's reliance on sexual violence, but this finding remains contested. Beyond these considerations, neglecting women's participation in armed groups, especially as direct perpetrators of violence, has also led to some very glaring policy failures. For instance, in the late 1980s, female combatants in Colombia were largely excluded from the disarmament, demobilization, and rehabilitation program, despite their widespread participation in Colombian rebel groups as fighters. In many conflicts, as commanders, women also order troops to perpetrate violence against civilians, including sexual violence. However, construction of women as victims of violence only means that they're usually not held accountable for the war crimes they committed in the post-war period. Importantly, female combatants also continue to be marginalized during the peace processes, and despite the women, peace, and security agenda's emphasis on elevating women's voices, these programs often focus on elevating the voices of civil society and non-violent women while marginalizing that of female combatants. Hence, as we move forward, it is critical that we revise the scholarly and policy agenda on women in conflict. And importantly, we must dismantle the narratives of women's universal wartime victimhood and recognize them as agents and critical participants in conceptualizing, perpetrating, and sustaining violence. We must also integrate the voices of female combatants in specific peace-building programs, as well as the broader women, peace, and security agenda. We must also promote empirically grounded research programs that collect data on women in rebel groups, which can be used to challenge widespread but incomplete narratives about women's experiences during war. Lastly, we must also critically reassess existing theories that are seemingly gender-neutral theories of conflict, but in reality tend to be like theories about men in war, and begin to include more and more voices of women, especially female combatants, in the research we do and the policies we make. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Apekshya. That was so well done, especially the vast ground that you covered regarding different women in different war, and also different roles they play, and also like gender assumptions regarding women in war. Dr. Farah Naz has joined us. She was having trouble tuning into this session. Dr. Farah Naz will present on Women Peacebuilders, a case study of Pakistan. As I said before, Dr. Farah Naz is serving as Assistant Professor at the Department of Government and Public Policy, National University of Sciences and Technology, Pakistan. Dr. Naz, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Keshab. Let me share the slides first. I hope you guys can see my screen.
Yeah, we can.
Great, thank you. All right, so thank you, Keshab, for a generous introduction. Today, I'll be speaking about something very important, and I think our earlier speaker has already touched upon the literature review about the importance of women peace builders and why women should be included in the research when it comes to wars and conflicts. So I will try to bring a more niche to this, the role of women peace builders and a case study of Pakistan. I will not be getting into the very literature of it, but what I do is I will simply go through some of the important aspects where women are required by the United Nations in peace building. always and always, whenever I speak about the role of women in peacekeeping and peace building, people do ask, what is the role of women there? And I always get so offended with that, look, half of the world population is women. So we need women in every walk of life, from businesses to corporate sector to in armed forces and to peacekeeping as well. Right? So gender equality is at the heart of everything. As I said, I will not be touching upon the literature aspect. I will be simply stating some facts and figures where women are required and what else should be done in my presentation. So it was even before the UN resolution, this discussion was there, but since the UN Security Council Resolution 1325, this became more obvious for the feminist scholars and the proponents of war and conflict studies that they need to incorporate women in peacekeeping and peace building. What for? To transform the entire mission of the peacekeeping. And why are they doing so? Because they, whenever when the peacekeeping missions and operators, they are on the ground, which are war-torn or conflict-torn areas, they need to reach out to the women folks who are there, women who are becoming a target of sexual abuse, rape, torture, and several other issues. So those men who are in the peacekeeping operations, when they are reaching out to the affected population, women, it's hard for the women to open up about the problems that they face. So that was the basic reason behind the UN agenda to incorporate women, peace, and security into the large stream security studies and peacekeeping operations. So their major role is to transform the societies and to rebuild societies based on the inclusion of gender over there, right? So that's the major role of women in peace building. So the focus is the strategic focus of the United Nations Secretary General on 4 key areas highlighted during 11th April 2019 UNSC's meeting, called for enhancing women peacekeepers representation from 15 to 35%. Now, there are 4 core pillars where they want to incorporate women there. One is the recruitment and training of potential peacekeepers, and then the global communication and outreach, leadership and accountability at all tiers, and creating enabling environment for gender equality. Despite the fact the UN is demanding all states who are contributing peacekeeping missions into the United Nations agenda, the United Nations is asking them to incorporate more and more women there. But there are several issues associated to the incorporation of women peacekeepers into the large stream peacekeeping operations for several reasons. And I chose deliberately to work on Pakistan as a case study because I wanted to know a society which is driven by patriarchy, a society which is driven by religious norms and culture. How would they allow their women to go and to serve as peacekeepers in a war-torn region and countries? So it was a challenging task for me to study. But to my surprise, I'll be showing you some numbers in a bit. To my surprise, there's a large number of women already serving as women peacekeepers or female peacekeepers in the US missions. Though the nature of their job is somewhat different, that are always and always bring into discussion with the agencies or the departments involved in the US peacekeeping here in Pakistan. So the issue is that despite strong evidence in favor of their inclusion, I mean women remain largely invisible and sidelined from formal peace processes and negotiations in South Asia. And I always wanted to understand, what are the factors behind, what are the reasons behind? Is it the patriarchy or is it something else? And to my big surprise, I found that along with patriarchy, social and cultural practices of these countries also have an impact on the roles of women in peacekeeping operations. They are there, but still they are not in the what is called the female engagement side. They are more into the office work, where they can provide official supports to the male male peacekeepers over there. At the same time, they can provide medical support to the peacekeepers there. They can provide psychological support, everything but getting actually engaged into the operation side of it. That I always raise here in Pakistan. Why is it like that? If you look at some facts and figures here, the total number of troops that we see here is 4370, where the peacekeeping mission since 1960, there are 46 missions in 28 different countries. That Pakistan, I'm talking only about Pakistan here, and the sacrifices that they put forward in terms of bringing peace in the world. And the largest contingent is in Congo since 1975, the equipments that they use. And then the 14 across the globe missions are currently deployed in the world. Now, where are women here? Women, they increase focus on gender balancing, since the United Nations is demanding all peacekeeping operations to include more and more women. So when I had a direct chat with the concerned department, I found that even the Pakistani government find it very difficult to include more and more women into the UN peacekeeping operations. And the demand was the mandate was to achieve overall 7% representation of females. So 16% of the military staff and the staff officers, 5.25% as a part of the contingent. So in total, 252. While the milestone was 130 female officers deployed during the year 2019 to 2020. I found that the government of Pakistan achieved their goal of meeting the mandate, that is 16%. But now the United Nations is demanding to incorporate more and more women than whatever they have at this stage. So it becomes highly challenging. The training of female officers at the moment, there are 22 trained at International Peacekeeping Training Institute here in Islamabad, and over 200 trained at the Center for International Peace and Stability, Islamabad. Deployment of female engagement team, the first Pakistani female engagement deployment in UN Mission Congo was in May 2019, and the team course commenced from 2019. Hence, while being sitting there in the female engagement training programs, I found that they are training not only Pakistani women, the female peacekeepers, but women from across the world. They have designed syllabus courses for their better training and equipping them towards how to meet the challenging environment that they face there. When I got a chance to speak to some of the returning female peacekeepers from Congo and other parts of the world, they shared that when I asked them what sort of problems you were facing there when you were on ground, and what sort of problems you were facing when you were leaving the country. So they were quite happy with the arrangements the government is putting forward too. But at the same time, they said that there are certain issues that we do face. One is the cultural restrictions, though they were all coming from armed forces. So they were acceptable within their own domain, that they can go and serve the country wherever the country and the state asked them to do so. But still leaving the country behind, there were several psychological issues that they confronted. Right? One thing was it was a war-torn country, and then there were certain kinds of conflicts going on, rebels attacks, so many other issues with that. So they felt like that their whatever their capability is and was, it was getting marginalized due to all the problems that they were facing there. So they need further trainings. And I was glad to find out whether on return they were sharing the problems with the other staff who were about to leave for the mission or on the mission. So they were preparing with all the problems that they can confront when they will be there on the ground. So there is the communication is too smooth among all of these peacekeepers. That provides encouraging environment for the ones who are there and for the ones who are returning home. So at the moment, if we go to the statistics, the numbers, the total deployed female peacekeepers is more than 400. So these female peacekeepers, they have been a source of motivation for the females in conflict-ridden areas. Also, they were so happy with the arrangements the state is providing them when they are there on the mission. Their privacy, their security, their safety, although they are all working under the UN mandate, but still the state involvement and the state sense of providing them safety and security was so intense that they were able to serve for whatever capacity they were asked to do so. So that was something that they were sharing about post their mission. And I also came across some of the females who really excel despite so many odds, like the cultural barriers that I have spoken about, the religious barriers that I have shared. So along with all of this, there were several women who really excelled in various areas where they proved that they can achieve much more than whatever they're capable of. So Samia Rahman was one of the Pakistan Army who was selected for the SRSG certificate in 2019, and she has proven that she is one of the best candidates there. Then there was another interesting female peacekeeper, Major Aruj Arif, who completed a marathon while carrying 24 lbs of weight, and she proved that she can set an example for other female peacekeepers, that if you are not involved in the female engagement side of it, you still can prove yourself something amazing out of all. And they kind of created an environment which is feasible, practical for all female peacekeepers who are there on the mission. Then we had another, Major Binish Hassan, who by the force commander is recognized for her outstanding work as the staff officer in UNMISS. So these women, they prove that there are avenues where they can prove themselves. At the same time, I met several other female peacekeepers here in Islamabad who said that they really want to work at the female engagement side of it, irrespective of the limitations that they can't or they're not capable of or something, they are trained enough, right? So the training mechanism, the training system that is provided to them by the state is preparing them towards the female engagement side of it as well, despite cultural, social, religious, and all those barriers. I was also trying to find out that is it only the Pakistani female peacekeepers who are not able to go into the female engagement side, or is it other countries as well? And I was told that no, in South Asia, Bangladesh is doing very well. They're female, they are really into the female engagement operations. But then there are other countries, including India and Pakistan and other as well, where women are not actively engaged there. So probably there we need to work towards improving to engage more female representation there in the UN peacekeeping operations, right? So I'll finish it here, and I'll leave with the questions if you have any. I just wanted, this is a preliminary research, by the way, so I wanted to, if you have any questions, I'll take them, right? Thank you, Keshab.
Thank you, Dr. Nas, for highlighting another important aspect of gender and security, providing rich stories of women peacekeepers, women Pakistani peacekeepers, Pakistani women peacekeepers. Our last presenter for the first sub-session is Dr. Dipti Tamang. She'll be speaking on decentering the WPS agenda, conversation on gender, peace, and security from the Global South. Dr. Dipti Tamang is currently employed as assistant professor of political science at Darjeeling Government College. Her areas of interest are women, peace, security, feminist international politics, gender conflict, and regional identities in the eastern borderland of India. She holds a PhD in international studies from JMU, and she is currently an awardee of Nehru Fulbright Postdoctoral Grant 2021. She is former recipient of Juban Sasakawa Peace Foundation Grant for Young Scholars from the Northeast 2019. She is currently working on the political history of conflict in Darjeeling Himalayas using feminist methodology. She has recently published her work with the International Feminist Journal of Politics, Juban publications, and web pages such as Livewire, Himal, Quint, and Rawat. At present, she is also a member of Confluence, a collective of photographers and researchers from Darjeeling Hills and Sikkim, which uses visual platform as means of storytelling of the people, places, and communities of these regions. Oral and visual practices form an important part of her research methodology in her ongoing research on political conflicts in the Darjeeling Himalayas. Dr. Tamang, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Keshab, for the warm introduction and also for having me on this panel. I'm very humbled to be a part of this fascinating panel, and it's very exciting to see these kind of new engagements with these kind of collaborative spaces on questions of gender and feminisms from the region. Much needed interventions in the difficult times that we are living in. So I have a very short and brief presentation which builds up from the work that I'm currently engaged on and I've been working on in the past 4 years of where I am located in the Darjeeling region, which geographically I would like to introduce the region which is located in the eastern region of India in the state of West Bengal, and which has a very long history of conflict over questions of identity and anxieties around belonging in the context of citizenship in the post-colonial state of India. And this introduction in itself speaks about how we always have to begin, as a friend and I were having a conversation earlier from the region, in terms of where we are located, speaks a lot about our own histories and relationship with the center from the margins. So why I felt talking about and what I am trying to do in my research is basically also draws from my disciplinary training of a scholar as a political scientist and with an interdisciplinary training in IR and drawing from, I'm not a trained anthropologist, but I'm also trying to draw from those disciplines as I built up on my, as I work on building up gendered narratives around questions of gender and identity, which is so interlinked when we have to understand conflicts in regions like the Northeast or other parts of India in the eastern regions and other parts which has a history of prolonged periods of conflict over the decades. Which then brings to my next point of understanding, when we talk about conflicts, especially in the discipline of IR, we use broad frameworks which are generalized, homogenized in the terms of our understanding of conflicts, right? So why I was interested in this kind of a research was also as my position of being both a scholar and belonging to this community, which has faced a very long which has a very complicated history over issues of identity, and also brings to the fore the multiple layers of complexities that are entailed in issues of conflicts, which then I felt helped not only helped, but helps us understand and both engage with our definitions or predefined notions of conflict. So recently, I've also been working on and reading up from scholarship from the South on conflicts in different contexts, such as South Asia, where I was recently reading this work by Sharika Terangama, who talks about the conflict in South Asia, and where she talks about and builds in this context of conflict as a whole, as not as an event which is suspended at times and which flares up at certain moments. And that's how when we get interested in locating or visibilizing the idea of conflicts, but how conflicts are so deeply embedded into the personal lives of communities, which are constantly finding a way to live around these conflicts that is embedded into the everydayness of these different spaces. And my interest in questions of gender and in questions of how then even within the margins, what are the different layers of margins, the different layers of identities that are then playing out in these spaces, where I was interested in not just locating at the context in which these conflicts are emerging, what are the triggers for these conflicts, but also understanding how questions of gender are then embedded around these issues, and how are then women negotiating with these issues, how are women experiencing these issues from the everydayness located in their spaces, both in the public and the private spaces. How do they remember these conflicts, which is where the idea of the oral histories became very important for me as a source of research methodology, which again pushed me to question, when we talk about or understanding conflicts or locating our research in the field of IR, how do these kind of methods also then broaden our disciplinary training, and what can we bring into the discipline when we look at or when we approach these questions through these various methods. And that is where oral history, as I emphasized, became very important, because women, when I went about talking to women and when they remember these events as they unfolded, it gave a sense into the importance of memory for me as a source of research, of understanding or locating and understanding the importance of loss, the importance of trauma, which is so strongly embedded into these memories, although they are fragile. And these ideas of questions of memory as a site of, reliable source of information or not, that is again an issue for another debate, but also inspired the work by works of writers such as Urvashi Butalia, who's done whose seminal work, The Other Side of Silence, has been an important source of contribution for building up this kind of a research method when I was doing my work. So that is where I picked up from. So I started with this whole introduction of the conflict in the Darjeeling Himalayas is again very different from the kind of conflicts and militarization that is experienced by the bigger conflicts that we are aware of within the Indian borders itself, like we understand in Kashmir, in terms of the visible, the horrible and devastating forms of AFSPA, for instance, and in the other parts of Northeast, the bigger conflicts. But even within these broader categories of the Northeast or the Eastern regions, you have these smaller protracted forms of conflict. How are they playing out? How do they then change or make critical interventions in terms of our understanding of how conflicts then emerge as these transformative processes, as a lifelong embedded processes, how it's there in the backdrop of the everydayness that is playing out in these spaces. So those were questions that I was engaged in. And when I was looking at these questions and building up on the gender narratives, it was not only about just rendering visible the voices of women, of how their voices were lost in terms of documenting or remembering these events, but it was also in terms of then me questioning myself as a research scholar in IR about like, where do I fit in with this kind of a research that I'm doing? Does this have space in the discipline of IR? Because I'm also primarily interested in questions of security, and as a WPS scholar, which has been such a fascinating interventions in the field of IR, as former scholars have already been working on, and that's not a new contribution I'm making, but I felt it was original in terms of this bridging of the gap, which Dr. Soumitra Basu also talks about in her work in terms of the global and the local. How do we then not just about and inspired by the works of, recently I was reading an interview by Professor Olivia Rutazipwa, who talks about in a brilliant interview, she talks about, the goal is not just about like, when we talk about and emphasize on de-silencing, it's not about rendering these voices visible, but also recognizing them as then important sources of theory, as original sources of knowledge where we can take from. So that was something that kept on pushing me to and motivate me to. So my intervention here and my attempt is to build up slowly on this body of work where hopefully I can then, sort of when I'm talking about decentering the WPS, it's not something new that I'm talking about. This is something, especially as the WPS marks its 20th century, and the scholars who've worked on it, who've established it, feminist advocates who've played an important role in bringing this intervention, have already now talked about what is the next step, So how do we then make the WPS important in terms of not just an intervention, but bringing about meaningful transformations, into the lives of people, of women, especially women who are fighting at the grassroots. So that is where I was keenly interested in questions of representation and participation when we talk about in the WPS agenda, because for countries like India, for instance, where in Nepal, we have a very, very brilliantly designed NAP, a very, very forward-looking NAP for that matter, which was designed, right? We have representation for the LGBT community. We have talks about the 50% quota, which was already the gender quota, which is still a process, which is an ongoing process in the Indian context. But even when we talk about the WPS or the absence of it in the Indian context, for instance, where the country, the state is in denial of the presence of conflicts in the first step itself, I was pushed to question this idea of what forms do representation and participation then take in the grassroots. One, that was the question. The second question was like, how do we then engage with this question of participation that was already taking place beyond the confines of how we understood as representation, right? Again, taking from Professor Rutazipwa when she tells, when we talk about diversifying, that the dangers of this, the agenda becoming just simply about including more women at the table, the question also became not just about including women into the table, but then also about asking how can this inclusion then turn into meaningful representation, and also about questioning the table itself, which again Dr. Shepherd in her work has done a fascinating and insightful, brilliant research on the discourses around the WPS and how it's embedded into this idea of the liberal peace and the institutions that are responsible for designing these kind of policy interventions. Recently, I was reading this piece by Suzanne Zugwell on the Global Studies blog post, where she is talking about the recent developments that are taking place in Afghanistan, as we even speak about this in the session today, that initially we've already seen how the war in Afghanistan was gendered, and there's been so much literature and work around it. But here she writes about how do we now look at and how do we endorse or extend support and solidarity to Afghan women who need support not as victims but as agents, because you have organizations like RAWA and other forces who are already working at the grassroots with a vision and idea of justice, or vision and idea of what kind of an Afghanistan that would look good, that would be gender sensitive for them. Similarly, in contexts like Darjeeling Himalayas or in the eastern regions of Nagaland, where we have the Naga Mothers Association, who already have a vision of how the questions of what kind of peace is it that they are looking for, what is the idea of a future vision of peace that they have in mind. And these questions are then so deeply tied to questions of then the colonial struggle, that the anti-colonial struggle that the larger cause have been leading to. So if you look at the trajectory of the Naga Mothers Association, for instance, which has been a brilliant force in the forefront, fighting against and for these causes, using different forms of negotiations, how they are moving around these power structures, trying to define these kind of vision of what a just Naga society would look like for them. Then where the questions of gender, then it's not seen as separate from the larger cause, the Naga cause that they've been working about and talking about, but also deeply interconnected to questions of militarization, of questions of political conflict and violence, which is then again something that these are not separated, but as very integrated issues. Like just 2 days ago, the NMA then had issued a statement where they were vocal about condemning the act of some few women in the Naga society who went around tying Rakhis to the to mark the celebration of the Rakhi Day on the wrists of the armed forces people. So they issued a very, very strong statement condemning this act because of the kind of injustices that have been met out by the society, by women in terms of their.
Will you be able to wrap up?
Yes, I'll just take 2 minutes. So these are the kind of questions that I was very interested in exploring and moving beyond in terms of how do we look at these questions. So when I talk about this idea of decentering the WPS, it's not just about starting point or taking off from the idea of a Eurocentric framework and developing a new framework, but also about understanding that the goal then is not just about pursuing the idea of inclusion or diversifying, but also about how we can then talk about these long forms of progressive struggle that women have been waging and bringing it together with these ideas and conception of justice into maybe an alternative reading of the WPS. Thank you. I'm sorry for taking too much time.
That was a riveting and compelling presentation on representation, identity, conflict. And I wouldn't mind, listening you for another hours, but I had to be strict with time. And can I just say that your project sounds fascinating, and it opens up and tantalizing and avenues for further research, especially in gender and security in South Asia. And I can't wait to see how it pans out. Okay, with that, I would like to open up a floor for questions from our patient audience. You can ask question to a specific presenter, or you can ask to, ask question that anyone can answer, anyone on the panel can answer.
Keshab, if I can ask Bharti a question.
Sure.
All right. Thank you for allowing me. Bharti, I was wondering that what issues you faced where women inclusion is not only to fill the gap only there, it is supposed to be for some productive reasons, right? So what are the factors behind that women inclusion is not productive so far, or if there is anything that I'm missing out? If you can comment on that, please.
Farah, who you were asking your question to?
Our last presenter, Bharti.
Dipti.
Dipti, all right, sorry.
Hi, sorry, my internet was also a bit slow. It's not my personal issue, if I got it clearly, but it's not in terms of personal issue that I've faced, but it was in terms of how I've been tracing the idea of the women's movement or the questions of women and gender and feminism in the region over the past few years. But it's also about, it was in the context of one, the absence of the WPS in the Indian context, like I was mentioning, because of the denial of conflict by the state in the first place. So then how do we then talk about it? What are the challenges then women face themselves? Then second was in terms of how, like, say, for instance, the Naga Mothers Association or other organizations have already been working, but the idea of then putting them on the table when they are already on the table, but not literally on the table, precisely because of challenges like, of the WPS or the scope for a NAP not being there in the presence or in the making anytime in the future. And how then that leads up to the questioning of the state's selective bias in terms of being choosy or convenient in terms of what kind of agenda to support or what not to support, with the Indian government being very strongly active in terms of an outward-looking foreign policy, where they've supported the idea of the WPS in other countries or even peacekeeping missions on the outside. But these questions on the inside, that is where I was trying to locate my research and questions around women's participation.
All right, thank you. But Dipti, do you think there is some cultural element also involved there where women are there on the table, but they're not as productive as they can be?
Yes, that is there, definitely. That is how women are then, when I was looking at women's activism, it's also in terms of a parallel activism of how their questions are one against the questions of the colonial or the post-colonial states, deciphering of the questions of identity, but at the same time also the internal struggle of how they have been waging a huge battle against the internal forces that they are working with, of the kind of diktats, so the patriarchal structures and practices that prevents them from not just going onto the table, but even when they are on the table, the kind of access then they have to the questions of, like, tools that allow them from being non-representative in the first sense. So yeah, those are the two questions that I've been looking at simultaneously.
Okay, thank you, Dipti.
Thank you.
Okay, any further questions? Okay, there is one question from Sagar Jankarki to all panelists. How would women's participation in international relations, women's rights as a whole, unfold given the recent takeover by Taliban in Afghanistan? And how would that affect women in other South Asian nations? Thank you for the question, Sagar.
If I can answer that, Keshab, if no one is coming up.
Yeah, sure.
All right, thank you, Sagar. It's such a relevant question in today's debate. Yes, there is no compromise on women's rights, no matter wherever, if it's Syria, if it's Libya, if it is Iraq, or if it is Afghanistan. First of all, we need to understand this aspect, right? We also need to see that how long it has been since this transition of power from the Afghan government to the Taliban. And now, so far in between this window, what actually happened, right? I think let's keep it that way, that our assumptions prove to be correct. The Taliban keep their promises, and they really give equal rights to women when it comes to education and when it comes to work. So far they are keeping their words, and they are saying that women will be given their due share in both in getting an education and seeking an empowerment. If they move from their words, then us, international community and the region in particular, have all the rights to go and to talk to them that where, when, how you have been turned back from your words. So I think let's wait a bit, let them form the government first. If they don't give the share, then we can say it's against the IR norms and all. And the second part of your question, that how would that affect women in other South Asian nations? I think we all share, South Asia in particular, we all share the same culture in society. Our traditions, our norms, they are somewhat similar to one another. So it will have an impact, 100%. It will have an impact on the rights of women here in South Asia if Taliban move from their words, if they don't fulfill their promises that they are making at this point in time. Another thing is that we also need to see, it is very unreal for any Taliban. I think in my lifetime, since Taliban were in power back in time and even now, they were never ever ready to speak to a woman on the media platforms and even to give them the right that come and form a government here, right? Their only concern so far is that women have to observe the hijab, which is their major concern, and along with the hijab, they can even go and seek education and seek an empowerment, right? So that if women achieve that right of seeking an education and empowerment in Afghanistan post-Taliban, so I think that will provide ample ground for all women in South Asia to fight for their right. And that would be a very good example set, right? So the credit still goes to the Taliban if they fulfill their promises, but if they don't fulfill their promises, then we have all the rights under the humanitarian law, human rights, and everything to go into to demand for the rights of the women over there. So I think this is all my personal opinion, and anybody else can also comment on that if they want to.
Dr. Keshab, I would like to jump in just to add to what Dr. Farah said.
Yeah, sure, Natasha, go ahead.
I haven't given my presentation, yes, but
That's
I just thought
perfectly
that
fine.
I could add a little bit. What I think is that in terms of women's participation in IR, I cannot stress more at this point to sort of introspect and look and understand that how many times and how women who had the opinion of what was happening on the grassroots, how they continuously were talking about, political processes at the grassroots and giving power and forming political collaborations, how women were consistently over the years, Afghan women over the years were talking about such processes and trying to shape such processes at the grassroots. And it's important to introspect at this point that how many times they were brought outside of Afghanistan, how many times they were brought to the peace table, how many times their participation was funded and their participation was curbed and their participation wasn't supported, that somehow, their opinion has not been incorporated, and probably is one of the reasons why we are in a state that we are in, or Afghan population is in the state that they are in. So I feel that at this point, it's so important to introspect and understand that this was a result of excluding women from the table, because they had opinions, they had understandings, which which the international community fell short of incorporating, an understanding that could have probably led to a different consequence. So I feel that's just what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for your perceptive analysis of the situation. We will continue Q&A after the next session. The next sub-session we're going to start soon. Our first presenter for the second part of the session is Khushi Singh Rathore. She will be presenting on feminist foreign policy in South Asia. Khushi Singh Rathore is a doctoral candidate in international politics at the Center for International Politics, Organization Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Her research interests are gender and diplomacy, feminist IR, diplomatic history, and international history. Khushi, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Keshab, for putting this panel together. And to be very honest, I don't know whether I can match up to the previous presentations because all of them were stellar. Just one quick point before I begin my presentation. I would just like to add to what Natasha said on the question on Afghanistan. I think it's also very important to remember that if it's a very personal opinion, if you're not an Afghan woman, after a point, you can't comment on what's going on. And you know what she rightly said, the women had an opinion, they just weren't brought to the table. And that is a big shortcoming of how IR functions and how foreign policy making functions. But I'll move on to my presentation now, and it's on South Asian feminist foreign policy. It's still a work in progress. So some context, I study gender and diplomacy, women in diplomacy. My PhD thesis is a study of Vijayalakshmi Pandit as the first woman diplomat of India. And in the course of excavating that history, I came across more women who were representatives of India in the international forum in that period, which I'm talking about, 1940s, early 50s, right after the moment of independence. They're official representatives of India, but suddenly they go missing in the chronicles. And to find these women was a Herculean task, still is. So my project is essentially what I call it a project of recovery. It's recovering history. And I'm really grateful to the previous presenters for how they've highlighted the place of women in IR and that feminist curiosity. This exploration of looking at individual women brought me to the point where I discovered that these women thought about what makes international politics, what will be that world post the post-independence world, how India will be dealing with the rest of what that one world, the world order will be. And it struck me that whatever I've studied in IR and international history so far doesn't take into account these narratives of history, these female narratives of history. And then I entered into it with a feminist curiosity. The feminist foreign policy, what my contestation is, so the current debates, discourses on feminist foreign policy, beginning from feminist foreign policy for India, is essentially locating it in a space where feminist foreign policy as an idea, as a praxis, comes from the West. It's a vocabulary of the West, and how the countries who have not adopted it should learn from these few Western countries, and incorporate it in their conceptualization of the world, and of course the praxis. This, for me, in my understanding, becomes, I'm literally struggling for words over here, but in my understanding, that comes with certain caution. One caution is because when you move with this tangent of thought, the presumption is that the feminist foreign policy in itself is something which is alien to the non-Western post-colonial states, and it's a Western export. I'm not the first one to talk about it. Swati Parashar, Bina De Costa have done a brilliant job of talking about how, the vocabulary of gender equality, justice has become the new Western export instead of democracy, right? In how we are talking about world politics. So my contestation is, in that sense, it's not something, I'm not the first person to talk about it. They've spoken about it, but I'm pushing it further back in history, because that's where I come from, and that's how I interrogate IR, where I go back and I look at the stories of anti-imperial international thought of women. And that is where I try to locate the blueprint of feminist foreign policy. Because if you look at non-alignment movement, and that's where Devkija and Shubha Chakko have written about it. If you look at the tenets, the very basic tenets of non-alignment movement, and their work on NAM and women's movement talks about how the basic tenets are equality, it's justice, it's self-reliance and voice of the most vulnerable. They speak with what is today's aims and ideals of feminist foreign policy. So then the question is feminist foreign policy that alien to the non-Western post-colonial states? My argument, my contestation is no. Where I'm pushing is that the blueprint exists there. The blueprint exists in the anti-imperial thought, in women's international thought. But I come there with the disclaimer that this is not the only site of excavation. It is one of the sites of excavation. It is, what I'm trying to do is I'm probably trying to open the conversation so that it can be built on, and scholars can look at not just women's movement, anti-caste movement, tribal movements, peasant movements, everywhere where this the basic values of anti-imperialism, anti-patriarchy, anti-coloniality, everything that stands for, the fundamental values of feminist foreign policy can be found there. So how do these different bases of non-Western knowledges, which have been forgotten from the making of IR and have been left within the domains of the domestic, something which even Kumari Jayawardena's seminal work on South Asian feminisms, where she talks about how women's movements were relegated within the fold of nationalism, so it's first nationalism and then women's movement. So they don't make it to that space of what we constitute as international. And like Christine Sylvester says, she wrote in her work long time back that the feminist IR is an unfinished journey. So I think I'm just tapping on the surface over here to push for building body of knowledge which constitutes feminist foreign policy, not just in India, but across South Asia, locating it in the anti-colonial thought. And I would wrap up here, and I would like to just take some questions whenever this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Khushi. Another powerful presentation, and this is so important to the South Asian context. Our next speaker is Natasha Singh Raghubangshi. Sorry, Natasha, I didn't have your bio. I hope you will introduce, if you want, you can introduce. And she will be presenting on India's engagement with UN's Women, Peace and Security Agenda. She's a PhD candidate at Monash University. That's all I know. Sorry for not contacting you before, but I hope you will tell us more about you. Floor is yours, Natasha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keshab. I think that is the only introduction that I have right now, that I am a PhD student, second year PhD student at Monash Gender, Peace and Security Research Center. And I am an ex-student of JNU. I finished my MPhil from JNU and MA, and I am a junior of Dipti, Dr. Dipti. And it is really amazing to see and listen to her again here. I just would like to put forward my warm regards to everyone attending the discussion today. And a special thank you to the NIICE team for such a fabulous event, which has brought all of us together. I will share my slide before I forget. Let me know if that's visible.
Yeah, we can see that.
Yes, just to begin with, thank you, Dr. Keshab, for taking our time to moderate this panel, and to all the fantastic panelists. It was really such an amazing experience to listen to everybody, especially sitting so far away from home. And thank you so much for engaging with the kind of work which falls under this topic of gender and security in South Asia. I look forward to your thoughts and feedbacks and comments towards my topic, which is India's engagement with United Nations Security Council Women, Peace and Security Agenda. Is this slideshow moving forward?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So last year, UNSCR Security Council completed its 20-year milestone. The resolution aims to ensure that all efforts towards peace building and post-conflict resolution aligned with efforts towards achieving gender equality. The resolution seeks to include women at all levels of decision-making and at every stage of conflict timeline. It calls for incorporating the needs and concerns of women in relief and recovery efforts. It also calls governments to design and implement Women, Peace and Security Agenda to demonstrate their commitment to implement the goals of the WPS agenda. As of July 2021, 98 UN member states have UNSCR 1325 National Action Plan. And why I'm talking about this is that the experiences of women in India's internal armed conflicts resonate much with the impetus that goes behind these Women, Peace and Security resolutions and agenda. Now that the technical jargon is out of the way, I will attempt to demonstrate India's engagement with the United Nations Security Council's WPS agenda and present this paradox, which is in India's foreign and domestic policy, which attempts to address these WPS concerns. The paradox is that there are several internal armed conflicts in India, and the experiences of women in these internal armed conflicts are included in the WPS agenda. However, to address these concerns, India chooses not to implement the UN Resolution 1325 within its domestic policy. And outside, it projects as a major contributor to UN peacekeeping forces, and it consistently highlights its commitment to the agenda in addressing similar concerns globally, outside, in other countries. Speaking about the internal armed conflicts in India, modern Indian history is replete with insurgencies and people's movements, grounded in pluralities, hierarchies, socioeconomic inequalities, having roots in pre-independence history of India. These movements are culturally unique. Each are marked by distinct language, religion, tradition. They have today become part of what we can say zones of armed conflict. These are characterized by distinct geopolitical nature, special national security laws which are applicable there, and a militarized day-to-day lives negotiated by women in these zones of conflict. Identity crisis, security challenges, underdevelopment, injustice, unemployment, migration, human rights violation, environmental degradation are some of the underlying dimensions of these conflicts. This militarized response, sorry, I think I've missed out on one of the slides, yeah. All of these movements are considered as a threat to Indian state's pursuit of its post-independence nation-building agenda, to which Indian government has responded with very strict laws, which are in the news almost every day on a daily basis. Some of them are like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, and I think Dipti dealt with it in more detail. And also, not just in zones of armed conflict, we have also seen that in areas which are not considered militarized, such as the urban center or other cities all over in India, have other laws that are applicable there that are constantly have dangerous consequences for people in India. The militarized responses by the Indian government has impacted women and young girls very seriously. Women experience and respond to these militarized violence very differently. They are survivors of sexual violence, resistors against the Indian state, peacemakers on the ground. And I'm only adding here to what Dipti had shared earlier with us. So I'm not going to go much in detail, but I'll try and cover what is necessary to shape my presentation. The categories that I'm mentioning are not clear. They are overlapping experiences of women in armed conflict, and they are shaped by their belongingness to different religious, ethnic, caste, and social groups. Sadly, there have been many instances where women in Kashmir and Northeast areas and Maoist impacted areas have faced humiliation in terms of rape, sexual torture, and killing. And these have happened because the communities are highly patriarchal, where women are carrying the honor of the whole community. Rape violates this honor, and it's used by a tactic by state officials to mainly punish these communities, and they're often perpetrated by the security personnel to impose the majoritarian dominance of the Indian state on minority ethnic communities. Some of these communities, which probably the state doesn't even understand or even attempt to understand. In some areas, it is also done to maintain the Brahminical supremacy of the right-wing Hindu state over Dalit communities or scheduled caste. Also, the institutional response to these acts of violence are often characterized by denial, collusion, destruction of evidence for protecting the perpetrators. In seeking justice to these crimes, women, often in frustration, have joined these armed rebel groups, and they act as supporters and sympathizers of militant groups. It is important to note here that perpetrators of violence are not just the armed forces, but militant and insurgents groups are also sites of patriarchy, and there have been numerous cases of sexual violence against women in these groups as well. As women resist the state and militant groups, they have also done so in peaceful ways and very strongly, so to say. They lead well-coordinated grassroots efforts in resisting this violence and protesting the AFSPA. However, their public participation is resisted due to gender stereotypes sanctioned by religion, customs, and tradition. I would like to mention here that my discussion doesn't even come close to understanding the complexities in these areas, and only due to time constraint and scope of this presentation, I've kept the discussion here to the minimum. Referring back to the paradox, in addressing these challenges faced by women and girls in zones of armed conflict, India is not fully committed to UNSCR 1325 in the domestic sphere, and it doesn't have a national action plan. Members of the civil society often point to this paradoxical engagement towards India's complex relationship with its internal armed conflicts. India has time and again denied having any internal armed conflicts on its territory, and this has something to do with the post-colonial identity, which I will discuss later. On the screen are some of the statements made by Indian diplomatic delegations as part of reporting to the international committees and platforms. They highlight India's continuous denial of armed conflicts. In contrast, India is vocal in addressing these concerns outside of the country as a global leader on WPS agenda through its peacekeeping forces. Diplomats from India at the UN have made statements which reflect India's commitment to the agenda. It has increased the number of uniformed women in peacekeeping continuously and recognized the importance of women's participation in peace-building networks at Security Council open debates. They also called absence of women's participation from the table as unconscionable.
Sorry to chime in, Natasha, could you please wrap up? Sorry,
yeah,
I know it's
just 2 minutes. I will finish. So in looking in light of this paradox that Indian government engages in, in my research as part of my thesis, I've looked at the gendered identity of the state and how I've been led to understanding this gendered identity of state, and theorizing the gender state is through critical feminist approach and a post-colonial approach, which have led to try and finding answers in this post-colonial legacy and in the way Indian state has been formed since the beginning. And just to quickly mention here that the process of understanding this gendered identity of the state privileges women's experiences as sources of knowledge, mainly oral history, which is so well documented in literature that has come out of the area under armed conflict. And just so if you look for answers, and this is just, this has not even shaped properly. And I think it's in the process of getting shaped, and probably in next 2 years, I would have some answers. But when we look at understanding how are we moving forward from here in understanding concerns of women and girls and answering questions related to their security and safety, we need to understand and dissect and theorize Indian state identity as a gendered state, where it privileges power structures, where it promotes differential, unequal role for men and women, and promotes a hegemonic masculinity that aims to promote different sort of gendered nature of the Indian state. And also trying and understanding that peace and security concerns faced by women in India are very different. We have to move forward from an understanding of a beginning point and an ending point of a conflict, which was sort of the basis of formation of these resolutions. So to understand that the agenda, the WPS agenda that has built up on backs of women from Global South, they need to understand that the peace and security concerns are very different at every level for these women. Also having an accountability of implementation of international norms and actually seeing an output and not just representation, social media gimmicks of including women from these areas. And just as now we were talking about Afghan women and, asking them about accountability before they come out and say that, this is what we are doing, or this is what we've done, and this is what we should do. But like, what have you done in past 20 years? And also giving power to the grassroots. I'm not going to take the agenda in an English language to a woman who's working in the field and say, look, this is what your agenda is, and this is how you should ask for your rights. No, it has to be made in a different way. It has to be, developed and transmitted in a different way. So I think right now I'm just grappling with some of these answers, and the enormous literature in this area is sort of guiding me right now. So probably next time when I communicate with any one of you again, I will have more answers. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I look forward to your comments and thoughts.
Thank you, Natasha. Such an important and a very relevant topic. Last but not the least, Dr. Preeti Sharma. Dr. Sharma will be presenting on another important topic, fighting biases and empowering women, a conversation on female leadership and gender equality. Dr. Sharma is assistant professor at St. Xavier College. She is also PhD co-supervisor. She has more than 15 years of teaching experience, and she has been member of various scholarly association, and her focus area of research is evolution of Article 370 and analysis. Okay, Dr. Sharma, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Keshab Giri, and I've been hearing all the participants over here and the panelists actually, and I could hear them since last 2 hours, means more than 1.5 hours, and I can only go for the means my presentation would only be in the same sequence, and more points have been covered over here. So I would like to go for my presentation, and I'm going to share my slide over here. Okay, I hope the slide is visible. Yeah, so my topic is fighting biases and empowering women, a conversation on female leadership and gender equality. It has been a topic of conversation since many decades, and presently what do we see that a very recent example we are witnessing over here, that is in Afghanistan, and but that is a harsh case which women are facing everywhere in Afghanistan, but the world is still not admitting the position of women. And the latest example means my focus is upon the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's visit to Turkey, and it had been a three presidents talk and a meeting, whereas two male were there, and she was the female, and she couldn't get the seat. She couldn't get the seat over there. She couldn't get the chair over there. And this is how this incident was, it was popularized as in the form of Sofagate incidents. So it had been, it's not only the matter of sofa, it's not only the matter of chair to be acquired over there, but the thing is how women are being treated. Means such a woman who is at the highest level of some commission, and still she was facing such discrimination on such a very reputed forum and a reputed meeting, but still the world was silent on this particular point, and the things were being means it was means the sequence was consequences were over putting the words on each other, and they were blaming. It was a kind of blame game. But the thing is how the world is perceiving the situation, the position of the women. Means traditionally women are trying to break the glass ceiling, although they are educated, although they are getting higher positions, but still there is a glass ceiling that barred them from entering leadership positions. And if they enter the leadership positions, even if they possess requisite skills and talent to occupy them, but still they are not getting the equal stage, equal stand in front of the world. And women traditionally play a larger role in the home, potentially affecting their role in the workplace, and that had been evident during the COVID period, when each and every woman who was working and who had to work at two places, who had to work at two platforms, at home as well as they were also working inside the home regarding their own business and regarding their own duties on their own employment places. So this is how women's role was increased, and her stress was also doubled due to this COVID season. And on an average day, 85% of women compared to 67% of men spend time on household activities. So this is how the situation is when women try to present themselves on the honestly, they are trying to present themselves on both the platforms. Still they are not getting equal respect at the level of universal platforms, and that is the kind of thing which should be revised and recalled and reminded to the world again and again. And 29 women in Syrian battlegrounds are 7 times as likely as men to bear the majority of home duty. This is the reality, actually, which has been the part of the research since last few years. And women face a host of stereotypes and environmental challenges in much higher levels than their male counterparts. If the woman is working in an institution and she is representing herself in a very leadership position, then still she will be facing such kind of stereotypes and such kind of environmental challenges in that they're on their higher levels, and they are considered as they are not such competent and who can work in a very balanced way for the institution, and they are given such other responsibilities which are known as soft responsibilities, instead of giving them the task to be cleared on their own skills, on their own potential, and still their potential is being considered as a lower to the men. And disproportionate discrimination observed when women attempt to negotiate their salaries, and their salaries are it had been the part of research since last 2 years also, that women were the major in number who had lost their jobs because of COVID, and they were the only victims of COVID when it became the part of negotiation of the salaries, when they are getting their jobs again, or they are working on their jobs, and they had to suffer on the grounds of the negotiation of the salaries. And women who negotiate their pay are 30% more likely to be perceived as intimidating, too aggressive, or bossy than men who do the same. So these are the stereotypes which are being faced by women at different levels, and they are facing it since years, and still the world is moving towards 21st century. We are running in 21st century, and the world has been more technically strong, and still the women are facing such challenges. The landscape is dry regarding gender equality. World Economic Forum report 2020 highlighted 4 aspects of gender parity into account: and economic participation and opportunity, educational attainment. See, the women are also facing such challenges on the level of on the grounds of economic participation and opportunities. They are not getting equal opportunities, even they are having more potential. And the educational attainments are also the challenges. Health and survival is also the challenge. And my counter so many speakers had also spoken on the topics like Jammu Kashmir, the problem of Jammu Kashmir, and the problem which is being faced in different tribal areas. Females are still struggling on those grounds. And today, what do we see? That when COVID jabs were being provided to all the citizens, and women who were living in the rural areas, as well as those who were living in tribal areas, they were the most excluded people who were not being considered to be provided jabs as per their thoughts of their family. Means their family people were also considering them at the lower at the last level, and that's why they are called as discriminated people. Means in India, we do call it, we do give a term for this, Antyodaya. Means Antyodaya is only possible. Antyodaya means one who is sitting last in the society, and that the rise of that individual is only possible when the family at the starting level is the family, and that is considering them equal in the society, and that is not being considered in real. And then next, when the question of political empowerment, still the various countries are there which are lacking the real participation, real empowerment in terms of politics, and this is how women are less representatives in the political terms. And those who are participating, those who are empowered, those who are leading in various countries, they are struggling with such kind of discriminations. Women in rural sub-Saharan countries are fetching water over 40 billion hours every year. This is again the part of the report. And World Gender Equality Statistics reveal that women have 75% of men's legal rights on average. About 12 million girls under 18 get married every year. Over 96% of sexual trafficking involves girls and women as per gender equality statistics worldwide. And gender pay gap. Yes, gender pay gap statistics show that approximately $28 trillion would be generated by closing down all socioeconomic gender gaps worldwide. And gender pay inequality statistics reveal that men have higher average wages than women practically everywhere. So these are the points which had been witnessed, which had been observed by this report. And this is the reality that is making women standing behind the row, and they are still struggling for their part. And a particular case of India, when we go for philosophical postulates in Indian womenhood, we found that yes, and we are participating in a conference of Nepal, and India's and Nepal's relationships have been.
Dr. Sharma, could you please wrap up your presentation? We are running out of time. Thank you.
Sorry, I'll conclude it in a time. Philosophical postulates are they are the reasons of connect between India and Nepal. That had been Sita was one female which was respected in those times, and the divinity of man women was the innate power of India, and Ardhanarishwara concept was familiarized at that time. It was famous. And today also, when we discuss about the male-female equality, we do find the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We do nurture the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. When we consider such concepts, then why not we consider male-female equality on the higher terms and on such platforms? Then ideals of womanhood in context to India, practical realities are there. Means there had been, I am not going to discuss this slide much more, but the things are that women have in each period contributed immeasurably in various fields like domestic affairs, social organizations, education, warfare, religious debates, etc. And my fellow presenters had also mentioned each and every part of the participation of women in various areas, and that is evident. So there is a question that why not still women are considered on equal grounds. So we call for my last slide, which I'm going to cover up. We call for efficient implementation of laws on those terms when through those laws, we females can be taken on equal grounds, and our legislatures to be involved in development, management, and monitoring of public services, as well as our legislatures should make such policies to make equal grounds for male and female both, and public services are required to avoid perpetuating stereotypes of women and men, and to play an important role in providing local professional safe care services for children as well as women and those discriminated people is very much required, so that women can get rid of heavy workload, and they can get equal stand in the society. And legislations are required, and in India especially, we had witnessed in last 2-3 years that so many laws had been prepared and presented to stop the violence against and harassment towards women. And this is how we are witnessing that governments are taking care of those things. But universally, we have to take care of those points, and media has to be most responsibly involved in the struggle against violence and harassment towards women, and such points which are presenting the the concept of discrimination, those points are also to be taken on the primary level, so that we can find such more women like Hillary Rodham Clinton, Indra Nui, Oprah Winfrey, Theresa May, Christine Lagarde, and I had to sum up my presentation in such a very short span, but thank you so much for giving me such time.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. Such a rich and detailed presentation on multifaceted discrimination and biases against women in India. Okay, now I want to open the floor for question and answer. If you have any question or comments, you can, there are already some questions here, but you can ask a question as well. You can write on the chat box, or you can use raise hand function to ask question. There is one comment that I want to read. Dr. Dipti Tamang writes that I think both Natasha and Khushi put in such a brilliant points of conversation forward, couldn't agree more. And there is a question from Sagar Jankarki to Natasha. You mentioned about problems faced by Indian women in armed conflicts, but what are your thoughts on domestic violence and other issues in a vast, diverse, and mainly patriarchal country like India? What would be your recommendation for government of India on addressing these issues? As you said, most of their concerns are neglected. This question is especially for Natasha Raghuvangshi.
Thank you so much for your question, Sagar. Yes, so I mentioned about why I started with the issues related to armed conflict is because the resolution that is the main focus of my research addresses and concerns issues of armed women, peace and security in areas of armed conflict. But as I moved to the later part of my presentation, I talked about changing the understanding of how we understand peace and security issues faced by women in India. And this includes, as you say, concerns related to domestic violence and concerns related to something arising out of the patriarchal forces working within our country, be it coming out of the, the structure of CAP or intercaste violence, politics of religion played on, women's bodies. So I think one of the things that I wanted to convey was that we need to change this understanding of what peace and security means for women, and for the international agendas to understand that it's not, it doesn't mean that peace and security issues only come out of, beginning of the war and ending of the war and stop at ending of the war, but they are ever present, especially in the Indian community. And that's why when we say giving recommendations for the government, I think it is not as much as giving recommendations to the government, but in understanding that how this government is constructed and how this government that is in power, or how the past governments that have been in power view the state as, because the way they view and understand India as a nation has underlying patriarchal problems. It enforces gender norms, it enforces unequal power relations. And I think that is one of the ways to first understand and dissect that India was inherently constructed as a gendered nation. And once we understand that, and once we dissect that piece by piece, I'm sure we will come up with some of the answers. But to right now give recommendations to the government would be, obviously that's part of what we need to do, but that's not the only part of what we need to do, because we will just be reinforcing a thinking that is ever existing, but the idea is to try and create a new understanding, try and create bottoms-up understanding of what the issues are and how they intersect with not just gender, but with other structures in the society. Thank you. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Natasha. There are two hands being raised. But before that, there is a question for Dr. Preeti Sharma. Preeti, when you say efficient implementation of laws, how do you perceive role and significance of international laws and conventions on women rights? That's by Dr. Varti Sibir, if I pronounce your name correctly. Before that, before you respond to that, Dr. Farah and Khushi, they have something to say. Please be short and concise. We have just 5 minutes left.
Thank you, Keshab. Khushi, if I can take the lead. Thank you. All right, so my question is to everyone. Like, since some of you are really looking into certain articles and all, by any chance, did you look into, or are you trying to look into revocation of Article 370 and the rights of women in Kashmir? Or is completely ignored there? Because women are also affected there. Our focus, the international community focus, is all on Afghanistan. What about Kashmir and the women there? Peace, gender, and security. What about in article after the revocation of Article 370? Anybody looked into that? Thank you.
Khushi, you want to go next, and then I will let Dr. Sharma to respond.
Yeah, thank you, Keshab. Excellent presentations. You know, Natasha, when you were talking about the gendered state, the Indian state being the gendered state, and it kept reminding me of, I don't know if you've gone through it, Natasha Bell's work on exclusionary inclusion. And I will highly recommend that book because it precisely tells you about the coloniality of the post-colonial state, in the sense the constitution says it's inclusive, but the lived experience is, you know, it's exclusionary in nature. And I think that's a very important point of intervention, because this is where we lose out, because we then concentrate on gender inclusive, but not feminist, which in my academic understanding and where I come from, to me, you can't be gender inclusive without being feminist in the very fundamental principles of it. So that is just one recommendation. I hope we can take this conversation further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Farah and Khushi. Dr. Sharma, could you respond to?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Keshab, and thank you, Dr. Bharti. I can see that you are asking me what when we talk about efficient implementation of laws, and how do I perceive role and significance of international laws and conventions on women's rights. As per my what I could understand, the thing is when United Nations endorsed a common understanding on human rights, and when we talk about human rights, then first of all we must understand the universality and inalienability, right? So when we talk about universality, the universal conception of rights and when we talk about fundamental rights, then they should be provided equally to all the people living there, and internationally it must go for universality, and no individual should be alienated from that, and it must not. It must also be indivisibility. That is again the concept of United Nations, that the promotion of one right may not justify the violation of another right, and this is how if females are provided their rights, then they should be promoted in all the manners, and the interdependence and interrelatedness is also important when we talk about economic development and overall development in a country. Then the interdependence is important, that should be taken on the primary level, And this is how equality is important. And equality is only possible when these three things are considered, these three things are taken on the primary grounds, and then only the discrimination would be removed, and participation and inclusion would be improved, and accountability and rule of law must be taken on the primary level, so that people can understand the concerns of equality in the entire world.
With that note, it's been a long 2 hours, and I want to thank you everyone for your patience, and also such a passionate presentation and discussion. Wonderful to see you all, and I learned a lot, and thank you so much, and good night.